and is United States Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations during the Carter administration. Bill has held directorships in a number of public companies, including U.S. Banknote, Time Warner, North Aegean Petroleum, and others, and since 1984 has been senior advisor to the investment banking firm of Allen & Company. Bill, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and I want to begin by thanking you and Tom Miller for the wonderful leadership you are giving to the United Nations Association, and to remind all of us that among Adlai Stevenson's greatest admirers and supporters and friends was Eleanor Roosevelt. And when Eleanor Roosevelt left the government in 1953, having made the profound contribution to history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she became a full-time volunteer at the United Nations Association and regarded it as one of her most important public services. I first met Adlai Stevenson as part of that generation who voted for the first time in the 1952 presidential election. I was already in the Air Force, and I went to hear Governor Stevenson speak at the American Legion convention. Well, if you ever saw someone, a hero, in the midst of a very tough audience, that was Adlai Stevenson speaking to the American Legion. And the whole event is best remembered by Stevenson saying, reaching out and quoting from Shakespeare. He said, "Out of this nettle danger, let us pluck this flower, safety." And I can remember the Legionnaires sort of looking at each other from side to side saying, what is going on here? We're talking about war, peace, let's get going, nettles and danger. At Election Day, I hitchhiked as a young lieutenant to Springfield and was standing in the hotel lobby where Governor Stevenson had arrived for the election night party. And by chance, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall came across the lobby, and I was in uniform, and as they got in the elevator to go upstairs, Lauren Bacall shouted out, "Hey, soldier, you want to come with us?" So I did, and there I was, watching Adlai Stevenson in that extraordinary, memorable moment when he quoted Abraham Lincoln and said, "I am too old to cry, but it hurts too much to laugh," as he reflected on the experience of having been defeated in that election. In 1960, I was privileged to campaign with him in New York City especially, and it was wonderful to see the adulation that he had from the crowds. But Brian's correct, because in 1962, we lunched together at the UN. I was then Robert Kennedy's assistant in the Justice Department, and Ambassador Stevenson reflected upon the fact that he felt left out. He said, they think I'm too old, I think. He was only 62 years old. But the real fact, of course, the matter was that in 1960, under the pressure of many ardent supporters, he continued to be available for the Democratic nomination instead of endorsing John Kennedy on a visit to Libertyville in the spring of that year. But his contributions, of course, to the United Nations, the thing that you would say about him, having been brought up in the great liberal traditions of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, we came to the 1952 election in despair, whether anyone could stand up to America's greatest hero of World War II, Dwight Eisenhower. And to think that Adlai Stevenson, coming to that convention in '52, spoke with an eloquence and a determination that truly inspired that generation, but continued to inspire generations of leaders across the country. It was one of his greatest contributions in keeping the Democratic Party relevant to what was going on in the country and truly leading it. What would he do today? Yes, of course, none of us can say, but I can't believe that he wouldn't remember the lessons of Vietnam and be one of the counselors sitting with his successor from Illinois, President Obama, and talking about Afghanistan and suggesting perhaps that the United Nations should be the source of convening an international conference that would bring China and Russia and Iran and the states that surround Afghanistan together to discuss that this is a truly international responsibility that the United States cannot and will not carry alone. The challenge of Iran and nuclear weapons is something that he would understand, having been one of the fathers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and would look forward to the opportunity that's coming in several months to renegotiate that treaty and make it once again relevant to all of the nations of the world and remind the world what the consequences are of nuclear proliferation. He would advocate again the rapid deployment force and say that the United Nations has a role, and that especially the United States has a role of bringing together the nations of the world in this forum. And he would understand what Tom Pickering was talking about in terms of the veto, and that although the many, many years of attempted reform of the Security Council has not been successful and probably will not be, that in fact you can reform the Security Council by the way the United States operates as its leader, and seeking a consensus with the Russians, with the Chinese, and with our allies, and in that way leading the world and going forward. Adlai Stevenson was a remarkable man. In fact, the mere fact that his memory is so alive for all of us today, and that you would come on this afternoon to listen and remember his extraordinary contributions is really a tribute to him. And I am reminded of what the Chancellor of Oxford, John, said when they gave an honorary degree to Adlai Stevenson after his defeat in the 1952 election. And the Chancellor quoted Joseph Addison, a great essayist of the 19th century, and said, "'Tis not for mortals to command success, but we'll do more, Sempronius, we'll deserve it." Adlai Stevenson deserved it. We deserve to have him as president of our country. Having been denied that success, he nevertheless led us into this generation of responsibility with great eloquence and great effectiveness. Well done. Very, very good.
Thank you, Bill. And now I begin with an apology. Felicity, you shouldn't have been last, but an accident of alphabetism has put you there, much as all of us who experienced the same in primary school didn't like but understood. We're also, I think, remiss in not having more diversity. Adlai Stevenson would not have approved that in this panel today. But at least we allot you the opportunity to punch above your weight, to defend the gender balance we have failed to give you. Felicity has been a long and deep supporter of the United Nations. She's worked as a graphic designer in the Department of Public Information at the United Nations since the early 70s. She's co-author of a UN study group report, Suggestions for Personnel Reform, sponsored by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as the illustrator and designer of the first United Nations children's book, Marie in the Shadow of the Lion. In addition, she's also a color expert working as a consultant with several architectural firms here in the city, as well as a painting teacher at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Through her primary focus in the arts department, Felicity has also served as an electoral observer in Namibia, Haiti, Angola, El Salvador, and Mozambique between 1989 and 1994. Felicity Yost is also a researcher for Look magazine and has been writing a biography of her parents, Charles and Irina Yost. Felicity, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for being so patient.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I'd like to thank the U.S. mission and Judge Liebling for this program and for an unexpected reunion of sorts. In the 1940s, Adlai Stevenson II, Ralph Bunche, Brian Urquhart, and Charles Yost were four of the planners who participated in founding the United Nations, who then, in 1961, found themselves working in New York for the very organization. Today, I'm delighted that we have on the podium Brian Urquhart, Adlai Stevenson III, in the audience, Joan Bunche, Ralph Bunche's daughter, and of course, I'm the daughter of Charles Yost. In the turbulent 1960s, the UN was confronted by the four horsemen of the apocalypse, who stormed across the Congo, Cyprus, Kashmir, Yemen, and the Middle East. At the US UN mission, Stevenson endeavored to halt those conflicts. He was a tenacious force, regularly prodding the UN community to enforce the provisions of its charter and restore, at the very least, a modicum of peace to the regions. After the go-it-alone style of the last administration, Stevenson's faith in the UN has been given an urgent transfusion by President Obama when he called the UN indispensable, while also pledging to a renewed involvement by the U.S. in UN peacekeeping operations. It is dawning on us that we are living in a world affected by the so-called butterfly effect. If one continent contributes to global warming, it impacts the security of another continent. And if one country relegates its women to a life lived in ignorance, another country's economy is affected. The UN is a unique multitasker able to tackle the countless issues critical to the planet's survival, but only if its members entrust the UN not merely with the responsibility, but also with the means and muscle to carry out its mandate. Stevenson was one of the UN's great champions, tirelessly explaining how the UN monitored elections in Africa, assisted farmers in Asia, built schools in Latin America, and housed refugees in the Middle East. And he helped his American audiences understand the positive butterfly effect that this work abroad had on them as well. I would like to share the story of my first one-on-one encounter with Stevenson when I replaced my indisposed mother for a dinner that he was hosting. After arguing in the Security Council all week with one particular ambassador, Stevenson had to fulfill a long-standing dinner obligation, but he didn't have to like it. And as the host, he was able to orchestrate the evening's action. With my father barely over the threshold, Stevenson dispatched him to entertain the gentleman and his equally unpleasant wife, while he led me off on a tour of the U.S. ambassador's residence. Sometime later, far too much later for my father's liking, Stevenson and I rejoined the other guests. Needless to say, my father was not amused, but I could tell that Stevenson was delighted with himself. In 1962, as you've heard from various speakers, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Ambassador Stevenson provided the world with an enduring lesson in diplomacy and oratory. I vividly recall being in the Security Council gallery, part of the audience, in a room full of people completely mesmerized by photographic evidence of malfeasance by the Soviets and by Stevenson's declaration that he would wait until hell froze over for the answer to his questions. I believe it is one of the defining moments of his history. In the aftermath of that crisis, Stevenson reminded us that the threat of nuclear war had so raised the stakes that if dialogue and diplomacy gave us half a chance to avert war, then we owed it to humanity to give them a try, a vow echoed by President Obama. Stevenson responded to those who wished to abolish the United Nations by calling for reform, warning that a world without a UN organization would be a world with fewer alternatives to the evil twins of conflict and chaos. I believe that one of Stevenson's legacies is that in the 21st century, 192 nations meet at the UN with the aim of keeping the dogs of war and the wolves of hunger and despair at bay. Stevenson maintained a dogged confidence that no challenge, no matter how small, could defeat him. Once when he had gone to call on Eleanor Roosevelt, all of the lights went out in her house. "Don't worry," said Stevenson confidently. "I'll take a look." Stevenson rolled up his sleeves and, armed with a flashlight, descended to the basement. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Roosevelt as she sat in the dark. "I do hope he knows what he's doing." As Mrs. Roosevelt waited, she heard a good deal of banging, but no light was shed on the situation. After a while, Stevenson dejectedly returned to the living room to admit defeat. "Adlai," said Mrs. Roosevelt, "you really should stick to politics and diplomacy and leave the lights to God." The world has just celebrated its 64th anniversary with the UN. Like any relationship, it has been a glorious one, but also one presenting a host of problems. For while the member states have cherished the UN, they have also cheated on her. Ambassador Stevenson challenged the member states quite simply and eloquently to to fulfill the tasks laid out by the UN Charter when he said, "Our job is to save the peace.